In this training, we're going to look at Observability SaaS network collectors, what they do, and walk through a demo for deploying and configuring them to send on-prem metrics to your Observability SaaS tenant. First, we'll talk about what network collectors are and what metrics they can provide. Next, we'll talk briefly about system requirements for network collectors. Finally, we'll walk through a demo for how to add network devices and metrics for monitoring in Observability SaaS and how to deploy a network collector. A network collector is software deployed on a server in your infrastructure environment that will gather performance metrics from network devices and send that information to Observability SaaS for monitoring. Collectors are also capable of gathering server and database metrics when deployed on the server or database itself. How the collector is deployed depends on the metrics you wish to gather, or, as in the case of running a NetPath probe, if you intend to make the device the source device for a NetPath service. It's important to remember that if you have an active license for Observability Self-Hosted, and you are running that to monitor your on-prem or hybrid environment, you can use the Platform Connect feature that is contained within that product to send metrics to your Observability SaaS web interface for monitoring. In the case of server and virtualization monitoring, Platform Connect will contain more detailed information as server application and virtualization monitoring capabilities in Observability Self-Hosted already pull and track more detailed metrics for infrastructure monitoring. The system requirements for network collectors can vary greatly depending on load and how much data is being sent to Observability SaaS, but there are some basic requirements for all collectors. First, the operating system and SQL versions mirror any deployment of the SolarWinds platform self-hosted, running Observability self-hosted. In other words, you must be using Windows Server 2016 or later and SQL 2016 Service Pack 1 or later if you are using a full version of standard SQL. Network collectors by default will use SQL Express, but this is not recommended if you are processing an extensive amount of network flow data in your Observability SaaS due to the volume and performance-heavy nature of flow data. To determine CPU and RAM for your network collector, you will want to have an estimate of how many network devices, specifically using SNMP, that are going to be pulled and that you will be monitoring. For a collector monitoring up to 5,000 devices, a good starting point is 8 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM. For a collector monitoring up to 7,000 devices, a good starting point is 16 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM. Again, whether you are processing large amounts of data or flow data will impact any server specs and whether or not you will need to allocate a full SQL database for your collector instead of SQL Express. Please refer to the Success Center knowledge base documentation for further details on properly speccing your network collector. To add a collector, you start with Add Data in your Observability SaaS tenant. Like adding any entity monitoring in Observability SaaS, it all starts with Add Data. From here, I'm going to click Network and then Add Network Device. Now you can either choose an existing collector as seen here, or you can deploy a new one. In this case, I'm going to deploy a new collector, so I'm going to click that and say Next. Now I can also use an existing token or generate a new ingestion token to use in the setup. Remember that ingestion tokens can be reused and have significantly less permissions than full access API tokens. You do not have to use a full access API token for network collectors. In this case, I already have a token created for network collectors, so I'm going to say Use Existing Token, and then I would select that from my drop-down menu. And I'm going to say Next. Now we have the instructions and the token for deploying the network collector software on our server, including a link for downloading the ISO for the install software. In this case, I'm going to copy my token so I have it. And then I'm going to leave my Observability SaaS deployment and go to the server that I have ready to go for installing my network collector software. Now I've already downloaded the ISO for the network collector. So from this point, I can just go ahead and mount this ISO and then move on with our installation. With all installations, we do recommend running the installer as admin. So I'm going to right click and say Run as Administrator, and we're going to let the installation start up and initialize. So I'm going to go ahead and click Start here. And while we are installing the collector in this particular demo, please note that you also have the option to install high availability for network collectors if you choose. You would use the same installer ISO for that. So we're going to stick with collector in this case, but we do have high availability options for network collectors. So I'm going to go ahead and say next. What it wants here is the API key. So I'm going to copy that off of my clipboard here real quick. And we'll drop that ingestion token in here and we say next. We accept our EULA and we say next. And now we determine our SQL Server. Now in this case, I'm going to use the default for SQL Express, which works for many environments that are sending data to Observability SaaS. But just remember, if you are processing extensive flows, or if our system documentation recommends it, you will want to use a full instance of SQL Server instead of Express. So I'm going to go with the SQL Server Express in this case. Confirm my language and my destination. I'll leave those at defaults, and I will say next. Now this is just going to run some steps here. And again, if you've installed Observability Self-Hosted and the platform, this probably looks very familiar in some ways. It is essentially the same installer. So it is running a few tests against the server to see if the installation is going to go successfully, give us any warnings, and we'll let this run here for a second, and then we'll take a look at any warnings that are generated. There are a couple of warnings you may see, such as making sure that TLS 1.1 and 1.0 are disabled, and you'll want to verify that for security reasons. Now you can click on the information bubbles here to get these installation reports, but these are two settings that you will want to configure in your environment, confirm, read about them a little bit to see what these are about. We do recommend disabling those for security reasons, but you will want to take a look at that, take in consideration your environment, and take the appropriate action if necessary. These aren't going to block you from installing. They are recommendations that you will want to take into account and then do what is best for the environment you're installing in. Once you have taken care of these warnings that you see here, you're going to want to go ahead and slip this slider over and confirm that you have reviewed the security recommendations. And then you can go ahead and say install at this point. The install will likely take several minutes, and IIS will be enabled if it hasn't been enabled already to support the web interface, and you will see that come up as the installation process proceeds. So now we'll see the config wizard run. Again, if you have installed and configured IIS, it will go ahead and jump right to the configuration wizard. If you have not, or if you missed an IIS component that was needed, the installer will automatically configure and install IIS for you. Now, the config wizard is very much similar to any config wizard you've used to install Observability Self-Hosted or legacy product modules if you have done those. Now, most of this, as you'll notice, has been automated. You didn't have to walk through web settings or any of the settings and provide SQL credentials and such that you do with a normal configuration wizard. Especially since we're using SQL Express, we didn't need to designate that or designate the database. So there's really no settings we needed to configure here. It's just going to run on the default settings to add the web interface, database access, make sure that the SQL Express install is ready to go. You will notice as a config wizard runs, there'll be a lot of steps where it'll say very clearly skipped, skipped, skipped. That is normal. This particular configuration wizard and what's being installed and configured are the components that you need for a network collector. And so that is different than all of the components that you would need for a full installation of Observability Self-Hosted. So as the config wizard runs and you see certain windows that say such and such is skipped, please consider that to be normal. Don't be alarmed by that. This is a customization of the platform install for a network collector. Okay, once the configuration wizard is complete, we're going to go ahead and leave this box checked and we'll launch the web console. So I'm going to click finish. It'll just wrap itself up here in the config wizard settings, and then it's going to launch the web console for me. And what we'll want to do is set a strong password. The guidelines are here for the admin account. That's for web console access. So I'm going to go ahead and create that real quick so we can log in. And this now will then drop me right on the network collector web console network discovery page. And so next we will go out and discover network devices that we can add for monitoring. So now that we have the collector software installed, next we're going to go ahead and run a network discovery to discover the entities that we can collect metrics for and send up to Observability SaaS. Now, if you've used network discovery feature in the Observability self-hosted, hybrid cloud observability, legacy module install, this process is going to look very familiar. So we're not going to spend a lot of time with an in-depth walkthrough of all of the settings, as that process is trained very well and in detail in the self-hosted platform training. Those are on-demand videos on the customer portal, and you can find those trainings there. So I will walk through the steps, but some more in-depth discussion and configuration is contained in that training. And if you are not familiar with the network discovery process, I would urge you to take a look at those videos. So from here, I'm just going to click Start. And the first thing it wants is says, where do we look for the entities to monitor? Network discoveries do run as a two-step process. You go out and discover entities that can be monitored, and then the software allows you to choose the entities you want to monitor. So we will look at both of those pieces. Entities can be added in a variety of different ways. I'm actually going to use a subnet CIDR format here. So I'm just going to say subnet. I'm going to add a couple of subnets in here to scan. And I'm going to add one more here. We do recommend that you limit your scans to 512 addresses or less on most networks, and just to make these scans run better. And so I'm just going to add these two subnets here with limited amount of devices in them. But please make sure that you do keep those scans at a manageable number of IP addresses to scan at any given time. I'm going to go ahead and say next. I'm going to skip over the adding of virtualization. I'm also going to skip over the adding of agents. These are both topics, and what is pulled and what you can monitor are discussed pretty thoroughly in the observability self-hosted classes. Also, what you can see and monitor in observability SaaS is discussed in those classes as well. So I'm just going to skip a few of these steps. I'm going to focus on the SNMP and the Windows WMI. So we'll skip agents. Configuration is for network device configuration management and does require SSH telnet access and CLI credentials. I'm going to say next, and we're going to stop here just for a minute on SNMP. We do have version 1 and 2C public and private configured by default. Most people are probably using version 3. That is done here through add new credential. Okay, you would add your version 3 authentication. You can then store those credentials, and you will need to keep those credentials around if we want to be able to pull those entities. So they are stored, but they are encrypted and protected at the same time. But they are necessary for us to not only detect the SNMP entities that we can pull, but also if you choose to pull them, we need the credentials to do that as well. So I'm just going to jump past this window here. That's going to land us on Windows or WMI. I'm going to add a couple of WMI credentials in here so that we can pull some Windows servers. And I'm just going to add a couple of more here just to kind of cover all of the bases. And just one more for the other subnet. Remember to use this link right here if you're not sure what privileges are needed. You typically do not have to use a full-on domain admin. Many people use service accounts here. I think that you have to at least be a local admin. It's a Windows requirement, but you'll want to double check this link here and just make sure you have a properly privileged account that's not overprivileged. You can use a domain admin account. We recommend just having the privileges that you need, and be careful of overprivileged accounts for obvious security reasons. Okay, I'm going to add in that credential here. So I've just got some credentials. You can reorder them in which order you want them to be tried if necessary. And I'm just going to say next here. We talk a lot about what you have in this monitoring setting in those recordings. Some of these settings are used for what we call scheduled discoveries, where you can schedule to look for new entities on a daily or weekly basis. So we do discuss those options in our discovery trainings on the customer portal. I'm going to leave this at WMI. It doesn't necessarily matter which one of these you choose. Is basically saying which one of the two do you want to try first. Sometimes that's specific to a subnet if it has more network gear or more Windows servers. But I'm going to leave this one as is on this setting. And I'm going to go ahead and say next. Retries and timeouts, I typically recommend to people that unless you know for sure that something here isn't going to work and needs to be adjusted, that you leave these at the defaults. They're pretty solid. And in many, many cases, when you run a discovery, these numbers will work just fine. So if you're not sure, go ahead and leave it. If you have an issue with a timeout or a retry, you can come back and adjust this and rerun the scan. So in most cases, these will run with the defaults. But if you see one here where you're like, I know that that one's not going to work, you can go ahead and adjust it. You can also give it a name and description or just use the default. I'm going to say next here. And if this was a scheduled discovery, this is where I could set the schedule, or I could say, I just want to save this discovery and run it later. But I actually want to run this once, and I do want to run it now. So I'm going to go ahead and click discover, and this discovery now is going to run. Now, a discovery can take several minutes to run. You just let it go. You'll see some progress here. You can run it in the background and go do other things if you choose, but it will take several minutes, and just let it go ahead and do its thing. And then we'll take a look at the entities that are discovered. Okay, so once the discovery is completed, discovering entities to monitor, now what we're going to do is choose the entities that we want to monitor. And once again, a lot of the ins and outs of searching and filtering these particular areas and entities that you can look at are covered pretty in-depthly in the recordings on the customer portal. So I would encourage you to look at those. So we'll move through these very quickly here and just show you what it is that you can add and monitor. Here we have devices. So these are the nodes. If you have an entire node that you don't want to monitor, maybe a workstation or such, you can deselect it from here. It's also important to note that you can add nodes and entities to ignore lists. So if you choose in the future to run scheduled discoveries, if you add something to an ignore list, it won't get picked up every time the discovery runs. I'm going to leave these selected. There are various ways that you can select interfaces as well, either by lists, or you can group them by a wide variety of parameters here to filter through what interfaces you want to monitor. By default, we choose operationally up interfaces, which are interfaces that are available to use and are being used, whereas operationally down are available to use and not currently being used. Be very careful about adding monitoring for those. You can generate a lot of false positives of things being down when they're actually just operationally down. One of the reasons why we don't have those selected by default. Administratively shut down are interfaces that have been disabled in the device configuration. So we're just going to stick with the operationally up with the different ports, trunk being things like uplinks or critical connections, accesses being endpoints. Monitoring type, we're looking at both servers and network devices. So we are seeing SNMP and WMI, and then hardware types as well. I'm going to go ahead and say next here. For ports, very similar monitoring here as well. For port monitoring, we're going to keep the defaults on that one and say next. Volumes, you will see other types of volumes picked up here that are found a lot of times in various images that are scanned on that particular subnet. I'm going to stick with the volumes that we have for monitoring here. These are default application monitoring. This is covered quite a bit in our observability self-hosted infrastructure monitoring training. So we discussed these quite a bit. I'm just going to leave those as is for monitoring as well. And then we get a preview based on our settings. What are we going to import? And this is also where you can add things to ignore lists. I'm just going to accept this default, and I'm going to go ahead and say import. At this point, this is where we add monitoring for all of these particular entities. Up until this point, nothing has been pulled and monitored by the collector. So we're just adding those. So now we will start pulling and monitoring those and sending that information to Observability SaaS. Once that import is done, we're going to go ahead and click Finish. And at this point, we'll start pulling and sending that information to Observability SaaS. Outside of discoveries, there's not a lot of options in the web console for a collector, as it's been customized for the network collector. So you see there's only a few menu bars. If you use observability self-hosted or legacy product module installs, you have lots of different menu bars and options. this web console has been customized for the network collector. So you do have some options available in your settings. You do have alerts and activities where you can actually just see events and message center to monitor what's going on through the collector. But this is kind of a pared down version of the web console that is suitable for a network collector. So you don't have a lot of the other options. Remember too that you can add additional monitoring for different types of entities. You can also go ahead and set schedule discoveries and such through the web. So that feature is still very, very similar. You can also run discoveries through the Observability SaaS web interface, and that process is detailed in another separate training video. You're going to have other settings. If you go to the settings, all settings, there are still some here, product specific settings, user accounts, credentials, but the scope is very limited here compared to the options that you have in a full platform web console interface for observability self-hosted. Again, as this web console is designated for the use in network collectors. I'm just going to jump back briefly now to our observability SaaS. I'm going to exit out of add details here. And I'm going to go to our settings and we're going to go to agents. So if we go to settings and we go into our agents here, we're going to see that this agent now has been added. It's showing as new. We get a status on the agent status here. We have options to edit or collect logs or restart. We'll see that we do have some of these agents that have a few little problems going on that we're going to want to take a closer look at. Why is this one disconnected? Things such as that. So this allows us to manage these agents. This particular area of the web console is covered much more thoroughly in the Observability SaaS Fundamentals courses. So you may want to view those to get some additional information on using Observability SaaS, including this feature set area. And if I go over here to my network, this is where we're going to see our infrastructure devices. We can see those listed in here, and we're starting to get some good metrics for them. Some of these were already added through our other collector, but the ones that we have just added polling for now will start to come online and show details as we have that information available to send it up to Observability SaaS. So we can see the data being sent to Observability SaaS from that self-hosted environment. This data, the features, how you explore entities, both from the self-hosted environment and from your cloud native environment, that is all covered very thoroughly in the Observability SaaS fundamental training course on the customer portal.